Many people make mistakes when they fall in love. Sometimes these mistakes push a partner away. A similar situation happened in the life of the heroine of this story. But in this case, everything went too far and cost a person their life. This is not just a story about a brutal crime. This is a warning about the danger that can await any woman when she least expects it. Get comfortable. You're on the DBS channel. My name is John. Let's go. Savannah Anderson was born on December 6, 1956 in St. Louis County, Minnesota, USA, the only child in the family. The girl's parents took great care of her, and a strong bond formed between them that lasted for years. In childhood, Savannah was no different from others, balanced, quick-witted, prudent, kind, and fair. Cruelty was alien to her. But despite the apparent idyll, when Savannah was a schoolgirl, her parents divorced. The girl stayed with her mother and they moved to Salt Lake City, Utah. At the age of 22, the heroine decided to change her place of residence again and moved to the city of Irvine, California. This move underscored her extraordinary independence. Striving for career success, Savannah simply packed her things, rented an apartment in a new city, and immediately got a job as a secretary at a bank while studying to build a career in her chosen direction. From the very beginning, Savannah established herself as a diligent employee and found many new friends. She was bright, attractive, and full of energy, although she did not like excessive attention, was quite secretive, and did not share the details of her life with outsiders. About 3 months after the move, a guy named Bill Mills appeared on her path. The relationship between them was very strong from the beginning, and Savannah repeatedly confessed to her relatives about her sincere feelings. Her boyfriend had serious intentions. They often discussed marriage, family, and children. But before that, they both wanted to stand firmly on their feet, get an education and high positions at work, and acquire their own housing. Both lovers worked in the banking sector, which brought them even closer together. Around 6:00 p.m. on May 14, 1979, Bill came to his girlfriend's residential complex, hoping to meet with her. At that time, Savannah had been renting an apartment in the Woodbridge Apartments for a month and a half. Knocking on the door and not getting an answer, the guy was not very worried, assuming that his beloved was delayed at work, busy with things, or went out somewhere for a short while. Therefore, he decided to return to his place and wait for a call. In those days, there was no mobile communication, so in order not to miss a call from Savannah, Bill had to stay by the home phone. Over the next hour and a half, he called the girl every 10 to 15 minutes so as not to miss the moment of her return. Anxiety grew because she was always punctual and responsible, and the call never came. The lovers had agreed to meet in advance, so this situation seemed strange. The unsuccessful attempts to get through lasted until 7:30 p.m., when Bill, already very alarmed, decided to contact the 911 emergency service with a request to check on the girl's condition. He knew that Savannah had been unwell in recent days, so he began to worry that her inability to answer the call or open the door might be related to a deterioration in her well-being. When the police arrived on the call, not only Bill was waiting at the apartment, but also Ken Bergensen, Savannah's boss, who also decided to visit her. He appeared at the address immediately after the end of the work shift, a few minutes before the law enforcement officers. Savannah was supposed to go to work on May 14th, but she never showed up. This caused concern among colleagues. Everyone was puzzled by the atypical behavior of the usually responsible girl and the inability to contact her. Employees and the manager tried to call Savannah during the day, but to no avail. No one was able to find out what happened and get any information. Such behavior was extremely uncharacteristic for her. Savannah not only never missed work shifts, but also always warned if she was going to be late or encountered any difficulties. That is why Ken Bergensen personally visited her home to make sure that Savannah was all right. It was already dark outside. The law enforcement officers tried in vain to see anything suspicious in the windows, illuminating them with flashlights. Knocking on the door also remained unanswered. Luckily, the officers noticed that one of the windows was unlocked. The policeman managed to get inside through it and open the doors for his colleagues from the inside. Getting into the bedroom, they found themselves in the middle of a chilling scene. Everything around was covered in blood, splashes on the walls and ceiling, bedding soaked through. And in the midst of this chaos, on the bed lay Savannah's bloodied body, lifeless. Her face was hidden by a towel thrown over it, under which bruises and a mutilated head were visible. Despite obvious traces of a brutal attack, the girl was recognized immediately. Everything indicated that before the murder, 22-year-old Savannah was brutally beaten. The police immediately noted that the towel on her face was a valuable clue. The attacker was probably well acquainted with the victim or had warm feelings for her and wanted to depersonalize her identity by covering her face. Perhaps it was an attempt to hide from himself the terrible consequences of what he had done. This is how murderers often act, who, in their distorted minds, try to calm the victim, ease her suffering, and distance themselves from reality. Another strange detail that caught the attention of investigators was the large number of jewelry on the body of the deceased. There was a pendant on her neck with a fastener in the front, not in the back, as usual. Several bracelets on the wrists, a watch, and numerous rings. Experienced detectives suggested that all these accessories were put on the girl after the murder, in a hurry, although the reasons for such an act remained unclear. The next interesting fact is that the body was probably washed after the attack. The traces of dragging left by blood hinted that Savannah was moved around the apartment. Bloody prints were found in the bathroom and sink. Similar stains were scattered throughout the home. But Savannah herself looked too clean for a person who had suffered numerous injuries with a blunt object and a prolonged beating. All the evidence found indicated that the criminal was obsessed with Savannah. The absence of signs of breaking in indicated that Savannah let the killer in herself or he got in through the window. At first glance, nothing valuable was missing. On the contrary, the jewelry remained on the body, so the version of robbery was rejected. Signs of rape were revealed, but everything required more thorough verification. Given the technical limitations of forensics in 1979, the main attention of the police focused on the search for fingerprints, palm prints, and biological substances. A palm print was found on the wall in the apartment, and a fingerprint on the inside of the toilet lid. However, the killer's hands were so heavily stained with blood that only very blurry fragments were obtained, unsuitable at that time for full use due to the low quality. The victim had clearly tried to defend herself, as evidenced by the numerous characteristic injuries all over her body. Savannah suffered strangulation, but continued to fight the attacker, leaving traces of her own nails on her neck, obviously trying to push his hands away. Against the background of the raging violence, there was no doubt that the criminal came to this apartment with a clear intention to kill. The assumptions that he was familiar with his victim were also confirmed. According to the forensic expert, the death of our story's heroine occurred around 2 o'clock in the morning on May 14th from strangulation, probably with bare hands, as indicated by the characteristic injuries and areas of torn skin that Savannah inflicted on herself in desperation, trying to save her life. In addition, she received several serious blows to the head with a blunt object, had a broken jaw, knocked out fingers and teeth. And to top it all off, the victim was also brutally raped. In view of all the circumstances, the police decided to first talk to Bill, the victim's boyfriend. Since the previous evening, he could have been the last person to see her alive. In such crimes, the closest person is often involved. But Bill was described as a good-natured and calm guy, not prone to aggression, and there were never any problems or conflicts in the couple's relationship. As Bill himself said, at the time of the murder, they had been dating for only about 3 months, starting back when she still lived in her old apartment and continuing after her move to the new home. Savannah had been living here for about a month and a half and had barely had time to get to know her closest neighbors. Bill last saw his girlfriend the night before, on May 13th. They spent time together, relaxed, after which around 10 o'clock in the evening he left. They both needed to get up early for work, and at 6 o'clock the next day they agreed to meet again. But Savannah never got in touch again. All this time, Bill behaved like a loving boyfriend, devastated by the loss. The detectives had no doubt that his feelings were sincere and his desire to cooperate with the investigation from the very beginning. The only suspicious thing was Bill's refusal to take a polygraph test, although he explained this by his lawyer's advice and the low accuracy of the technique. Despite this, the police had almost no doubt that Bill was not involved. At the very least, Savannah actively resisted the attacker, considering the many injuries he received. The absence of wounds on her boyfriend convinced the detectives of his innocence. Bill was released for the period of examination of the collected palm and fingerprints, which at that time took much longer than now. The tests were expected to take several weeks. The next person who attracted the attention of the detectives was Savannah's immediate supervisor, Ken Bergenson. During the interrogation, Ken admitted that he had met the girl not so long ago, namely after she got a job at the bank. According to Ken, they had a warm, friendly relationship. He treated Savannah almost paternally, even helping her move to a new apartment. From time to time, they casually chatted over a cup of tea at work. But as Ken assured, this friendship never went beyond the established boundaries. Ken was married, and his wife confirmed her husband's words. In addition, he also had no characteristic injuries that would indicate self-defense on the part of the victim. Ken's palm and fingerprints were taken just in case and sent for examination, after which he was released. In fact, this is where the list of suspects ended. Savannah had no bad habits and did not make acquaintances with dubious individuals, so the search for the criminal reached a dead end. The detectives decided to talk to the girl's neighbors and the employees of the residential complex. Among the latter, 2 security guards stood out who could have noticed something suspicious. The first of them was Chuck Duell, who on the night of the murder took the shift in the evening and worked until 6:30 in the morning. Right at the beginning of the interrogation, he told the police that he hardly knew the deceased. They just greeted each other when they met. Chuck had only dealt with Savannah once in everyday life. When she forgot her keys and couldn't get into her apartment, the security guard climbed into the home through the window and let the girl in. Chuck immediately emphasized that if his fingerprints were found on the window, it was related to this very incident that happened about a week before the tragedy. This statement immediately seemed suspicious, as if the guard was trying to make excuses in advance. Then, Chuck gave a detailed report of his working night. After taking over the shift, he first made his rounds around the residential complex and then dozed off in the company vehicle. But around 1:30 a.m., Chuck was awakened by his shift mate Robert Sellers, nicknamed Bob, who suddenly, without permission, got into his car. Completely spontaneously, Bob suggested going to grab a bite to eat at the nearest restaurant, located just a 10-minute drive from their residential complex. And although Chuck had to constantly be at his post, he agreed to keep his colleague company. The guards returned only after 2 hours. Having received this information, the police decided to clarify the details with Bob Sellers himself. It turned out that Robert was a Marine, and at the time of the events was serving at the local base. In parallel, he got a job as a security guard in the residential complex, where he worked in shifts, trying in this way to combine 2 jobs and save money. According to Bob, he last saw Savannah around 10 o'clock in the evening on May 13th in the window when she was talking on the phone. The man himself was just leaving work at that moment, and Savannah was standing by the window. The police checked this information and found out that Savannah had indeed last talked on the phone with her mother at about the same time that Bob indicated. The guard did not lie and helped establish the time frame. As Robert explained, after the shift, he could not fall asleep in any way, although the next morning he had to get up again for service. Therefore, around 3 o'clock in the morning, the man returned to his partner Chuck and suggested going to get something to eat. In general, the stories of the guards coincided, with the exception of one point. According to Bob, he arrived at the residential complex around 3 in the morning and immediately suggested that Chuck go eat, and Chuck claimed that his partner woke him up around 1:30. Perhaps it was an ordinary slip of the tongue, or one of the men simply got confused with the time. But the detectives decided to conduct a simultaneous interrogation of both guards in order to finally clarify the timeline of events. Hearing his partner's story, Chuck became confused and suddenly admitted that he did not remember the exact time well, since he had dozed off. Now he was more inclined to Bob's version. In the end, both men, guessing the suspicions of the police, stated that they had an alibi. At the restaurant where they went, their friend, a waitress named Gail, worked. Savannah had to confirm the guard's visit and approximate time. That's what Gail did, although she admitted that she couldn't say for sure what time the men arrived. At that moment, the waitress was terribly tired and could barely stay on her feet. However, this was enough to clear the suspicion from the guards. When the examination of fingerprints and palm prints was finally completed, it became clear that neither the victim's boyfriend nor her boss left bloody traces at the crime scene. The investigation was at an impasse. Due to the lack of obvious suspects, the detectives suggested that Savannah's murder could have been committed by a serial maniac. In the months leading up to Savannah Anderson's murder, a series of crimes against women aged 17 to 35 occurred in Orange County. Victims were found beaten to death and strangled in their bedrooms. Despite the similar modus operandi, Savannah's case had a number of differences from other incidents. In particular, the killer covered the girl's face, used her jewelry, and washed the body, which did not correspond to the typical behavior of the so-called bedroom killer, as the criminal was dubbed in the media due to the locations where the victims were found. A comparison of fingerprints also did not yield matches with other cases. It became clear that Savannah's case was different from the rest of the series. Investigators suggested that the perpetrator was trying to imitate the style of the bedroom killer to cover his tracks, but made mistakes. Detectives were convinced that the killer was familiar with Savannah, given the towel on her face, so they focused on studying the victim's inner circle. The investigation dragged on for months and years, and even 5 years after the tragedy, there was no breakthrough. The situation changed with the arrival of a new detective who decided to take a fresh look at the case. He immediately rejected the version of a serial killer and again drew attention to the security guards of the residential complex, whose testimonies contained discrepancies and aroused suspicion. In the detective's opinion, the crime could have been spontaneous, and the killer probably felt remorse, which would explain the washing of the body, decoration, and covering of the face. The investigator decided to reinterrogate Chuck Duell and asked him to reproduce the events of the fatal evening in detail. Chuck repeated his previous story, but with some differences. In particular, he recalled that his partner Bob Sellers came to him in the car in a shirt, not in uniform. Chuck also emphasized that he and Bob were not friends and had never spent time together outside of work before. According to Chuck, he agreed to go with Bob because it was calm around the complex, and he himself was hungry. Another important detail was Chuck's confession about Bob's attitude towards Savannah. Allegedly, Robert once let slip that he felt an attraction to the girl who smiled at him. Bob was allegedly determined to ask Savannah out on a date and have sex with her, despite her having a boyfriend. Robert stated that he didn't care about the consequences, but he had to do it. Chuck understood that there could be nothing between them, and Savannah's smile when greeting was just a manifestation of her benevolent nature, not a sign of affection. These new details raised suspicions among the investigators. In particular, the claim about the absence of friendly relations between the guards did not align with their joint trip to the diner and discussion of personal topics. The question arose whether the real killer was trying to shift the blame onto his partner by adding compromising details to the story. Chuck himself claimed that he simply remembered these details after years, but could not explain why he had not turned to the police earlier. Investigators were convinced that one of the guards was behind the murder, so they sent the palm prints of both for re-examination. Thanks to the latest technology, the result was obtained within 24 hours, despite the fact that the prints at the crime scene were previously considered unreadable due to the large amount of blood. Digital analysis confirmed that the killer was none other than Bob Sellers. The new technique made it possible to identify 24 matching points between the bloody print at the crime scene and Robert's palm. At the time of his arrest, Bob was living in his trailer in the city of Brea, California. In the 5 years that had passed, he had managed to get married and have children, although he constantly struggled with difficulties and bad habits, trying to provide for his family. During the interrogation, Bob initially repeated his old version of events and denied involvement in the murder, but under the pressure of evidence, he began to get nervous, get confused, and make mistakes in his testimony. Eventually, after a few hours, Robert confessed that he wanted to tell the truth about the events of that fatal evening. It turned out that Chuck's story about his feelings for Savannah was true. The military man really fell in love with the girl at first sight, but for a long time did not dare to talk to her, mistakenly perceiving her friendly smiles as a manifestation of mutual affection. When on that fateful night Bob saw Savannah talking on the phone with her mother, he decided to act. While Savannah was distracted by the conversation and could not hear what was happening around her, he sneaked into her bedroom through the open window. Bob was convinced that he only needed to confess his love to Savannah, and she would definitely agree to date him, realizing that he was a good guy. And if this plan did not work, then he was ready to persuade her to change her mind by any means. According to Bob, he did not expect that everything would turn out so terribly and go so far. The further development of events became quite predictable for everyone except the killer himself. He clearly expected something different. Probably these strange and inconsistent decisions were connected with the fact that he actively used prohibited substances and was not fully aware of the degree of his imagined foolishness. As soon as 23-year-old Bob Sellers left the bedroom, Savannah had already managed to hang up the phone. She was very frightened, started screaming and tried to drive away the uninvited guest. At this time, Bob continued to repeat again and again that he was a good guy, had feelings for her, so Savannah should give him a chance. Everything went wrong from the start. Savannah did not listen to him, continued to call for help, demanded that Bob get out of her apartment. Realizing that the plan had not worked, Robert became frightened. He did not know what to do, but understood that Savannah had to shut up. The young man was afraid that he would have problems with the law. He would lose his position in the army and in security. Of course, all this was not part of his plans. The guard of the residential complex grabbed the girl and tried to close her mouth with his hand, but this only made the situation worse. Savannah began to resist, tried to run out of the room to call for help outside the apartment. Without thinking twice, Bob hit her several times on the head with a baton. She lost consciousness and fell to the floor. The guy was no longer in control of himself. He knelt down in front of his victim and began to strangle her. After that, Robert got out of Savannah's bedroom. He noticed that Chuck was making his rounds around the residential complex. Fearing that the crime would be exposed, he took off his uniform and crumpled it in his hands so that the blood would not be visible on it. Bob just went home, took a shower there, changed clothes, and decided to return to the murdered woman's apartment. This time, he had the goal of raping the body in order to finally get what he wanted. To suppress the remnants of morality, he took a decent dose of illegal substances. The criminal wanted the body to be clean before the abuse, so he dragged the murdered Savannah into the bathroom and washed her. Then he dressed the girl in all the jewelry he found in her house so that she would be especially beautiful in front of him. Having finished his dirty business, he tried to get out. It was about 3 a.m. From afar, Bob noticed Chuck in his car. He did not suspect that his partner had dozed off and did not see him. To somehow smooth over the situation, he came up with a plan that they needed to go get something to eat. This allowed, on the one hand, to provide himself with an alibi, on the other hand, to provide access to the residential complex to all sorts of dark personalities in order to shift the blame onto them. In any case, Bob was sure that no one would think of a guard. During the first interrogations at the police, Robert lied about the time as he wanted to confuse the investigation. Fortunately for the criminal, this was not necessary. Finally, thanks to the examination, the police had strong evidence against the criminal. On March 29, 1984, 28-year-old Bob was charged with murder, attempted rape, and abuse of a corpse. Strong evidence and a recording of his confession helped quickly convince the jury of his guilt. But the criminal's lawyer was not going to give up, because the death penalty for the defendant was on the horizon. According to the defense attorney, the prosecutor's office did not have material evidence that would reasonably assert whether the rape was committed before or after the murder. Despite the criminal's confession, the lawyer managed to find a loophole in his words and refute the opinion of the prosecutor's office. The lawyer insisted that it was all the fault of Robert's altered state after using drugs. Moreover, Bob worked 2 jobs, was very overworked, slept poorly, and insomnia also affected him. In this state, the guard simply could not control himself, which became the cause of the tragedy. To confirm his words, he cited the testimony of Bob's friends, relatives, and fellow servicemen. They all unanimously claimed that Robert had never raised his hand against women, was a harmless, decent person who was simply not capable of murder. In the end, in order not to delay the proceedings, the killer was offered a plea bargain. He agreed to plead guilty to first-degree murder, after which he was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of early release after 25 years behind bars. To this day, he continues to serve his sentence in prison. Savannah's death shocked her loved ones the most. Family and friends knew that Savannah had moved to the apartment for safety reasons. She repeatedly stated that under the protection of round-the-clock security, she would feel much calmer than at her former place of residence. This residential complex was recommended to her by her boss. No one could even imagine that the person called to protect would turn out to be a murderer. Interestingly, the criminal, who had brutally beaten the girl to death, had never been held responsible for any criminal episodes before or after the crime. His biography was carefully checked. Now the question arose, did he kill during all these 5 years before his arrest, remaining unpunished? In any case, involvement in other crimes could not be proven. As for the other victims, 7 women who were killed differently than Savannah, Bob denied his probable participation. The former guard seemed to the police a suitable suspect for such episodes, but during the check, he was removed from the list of probable criminals due to the mismatch of fingerprints. Later, the bedroom killer was still caught, and he turned out to be a man named Jared Parker. Of the 11 attacks, 5 of his victims survived and identified him. The man was found guilty of 6 murders and rapes, as well as 5 attempted murders. In '96, Gerald was sentenced to death, which has not yet taken place. The tragedy that happened to Savannah Anderson is a horrific example of how obsessive infatuation, unhealthy passions, and uncontrolled aggression can lead to fatal consequences. This story demonstrates that even people called to protect and guard are capable of the most terrible crimes. Bob Sellers, the guard of the residential complex, allowed his irrational feelings for Savannah to grow into an obsession. His distorted perception of reality, amplified by drug use, led to the brutal murder of an innocent girl. This tragedy reminds us of the importance of timely recognition and control of our emotions, as well as the danger of obsessive ideas. One of the key factors that contributed to the tragedy was Bob's abuse of narcotic substances. This once again emphasizes the destructive impact of drugs on a person's psyche and their ability to exercise self-control. Combating drug addiction and the availability of illicit drugs is an important step towards preventing such crimes. Savannah's story also makes us think about the importance of careful selection of personnel, especially when it comes to work in the field of security and protection. After all, people who hold such positions should not only be professionals in their field, but also morally stable individuals. Perhaps a more meticulous selection and regular psychological checks of employees would have helped to identify the potential danger posed by Bob Sellers. At the same time, this tragedy reminds us that no one is immune from encountering evil, even in places that seem safe. Therefore, each of us must be vigilant, trust our intuition, and not neglect potential signs of danger. If someone's behavior causes concern or seems strange, one should not remain silent. It is necessary to report this to the appropriate authorities or people you trust. Finally, this story is a warning to each of us. It prompts reflections on how our actions, even unconscious ones, can affect other people. It is necessary to treat the feelings and personal boundaries of others with respect, not to cross the line of what is allowed, and always remember the responsibility for our own actions. Honoring the memory of Savannah Anderson and all victims of such crimes, we must make every effort to create a society in which every person will feel protected and safe. And let this tragedy be a reminder to each of us about the value of human life and the need to take care of each other.